Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So, in our last lecture, we were discussing aerobic respiration. And critically, that process, again, going back to the root of the word aero, meaning air, requires oxygen. But what happens when oxygen is scarce? So, is there a way that our bodies can produce energy, produce ATP, without the use of oxygen in the important step? And the answer is yes. And we have these situations where sometimes oxygen consumption, so the ability to use that oxygen in that cellular respiration process, exceeds oxygen intake. So that could be, for example, in high intensity exercise. And in this case, the electron transport chain has no oxygen to receive electrons. So what do our cells do in this case? And the answer is fermentation. Before the demise of the Bon Appetit YouTube channel, there was a wonderful show called It's Alive with Brad Leone that examined fermentation of foods. That same fermentation is actually the same sort of thing that can actually happen within our cells. So we're going to again talk about what is happening at a cellular level. So we know that the very first step of aerobic respiration occurs in the absence of oxygen, and so that is what the process of fermentation essentially is going to make use of, is this step glycolysis. And in the process of fermentation, products essentially are strictly looking at glycolysis. So glycolysis is the first step of fermentation. And all of this is going to take place in the cytoplasm. And the result of this creates lactic acid or alcohol. And that's where you get, and that's why yeasts, which are particularly adept at fermentation, are often used in food preparation, and makes use of this derivative of alcohol. So let's take a look at where all this is happening in the cell. So as I said previously, essentially fermentation is making use of the first pathway of aerobic respiration, glycolysis. And that is all happening in the cytoplasm of the cell. So the mitochondria are not going to be used in the process of fermentation. And in this case, we have glucose entering, and we have glycolysis occurring, and we have this NAD plus then becoming gained electrons reduced to NADH, which then reacts with pyruvate to create these fermentation products, either lactic acid or alcohol, which then leaves the cell. And in this process, a smaller amount of ATP is replenished. But what's important to note is this step right here, where we have this NADH, and that is really what we need for fermentation to occur, is this excess of NAD plus in order for this to process through. And in your quiz, I'm going to have you watch a video that specifically examines this pathway a little bit more closely, and you can sort of understand the different products and what is needed to, again, create this process of ATP. However, it's important to note that much fewer ATP are produced in this process than in the process of aerobic respiration. So while fermentation is a way to create energy and is often used by different cells where there is not oxygen present, so think archaea, think about those bacteria in extreme environments. This is a process to create some sort of ATP, but it's nowhere near the efficient transport mechanisms that we get with aerobic respiration. So I want to zoom out just a little bit and discuss these different processes that are happening globally in the environment. So previously, when I first introduced the equation for aerobic respiration, I noted that it was very similar to the equation for photosynthesis, and that's because essentially cellular respiration is in some ways analogous to photosynthesis, in that they need one another in order to create the different products and reactants that are used for each process. So in respiration, we exhale carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide is used for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis helps create glucose, which is glucose and oxygen, which again are the primary inputs for cellular respiration and the creation of ATP. So it's important to note that this is an important cycle that occurs both in photosynthesis and respiration. The ability to create energy is dependent on the products of each of these different and unique reactions. So another zoom out portion that I wanted to talk about is, previously in this book we were discussing the process by which we gain energy from food in the lens of understanding obesity, which is, again, influenced by both biology and culture. And an important molecule that we should discuss as part of this, or part of our cellular examination of these different macromolecules, is understanding trans fat, hydrogenated fat, saturated fats, and understanding how they behave in the body. So trans fat is a type of vegetable fat that has been hydrogenated, which means hydrogen atoms have been added that allow it to become solid at room temperature. An example of a hydrogenated fat or a trans fat is palm oil, and you probably note that in a lot of processed foods, palm oil is the primary fat that's used, and that's because it's stable at this room temperature and it's able to preserve food for sort of a long time. And these hydrogenated fats behave in the body similar to a saturated fat, which is essentially an animal fat, like butter. And again, saturated fat is solid at that room temperature. So this hydrogenated fat is again going to behave like these more cultured fats that remain solid at room temperature. But why is that specifically? And ultimately, it's all down to the structure of these fats. So let's look at an unsaturated fatty acid, so like oleic acid. And this is what the fat that makes up olive oil. And you see that it has this cis, what we call a cis chain, this double bond here that creates this kink in this long line of carbon hydrogen bonds. And this kink is what allows it to stay liquid at room temperature, because essentially these molecules can't stack on top of each other. However, if we look at a saturated fat, such as something that is found in animal fats, we see that there's no double bond here. And this double bond allows these fats to stack on top of one another and be solid at room temperature. So with trans fat, we're able to mimic saturated fats by having, again, we still have this double bond, which we see in the unsaturated fat, but we see that is oriented in a different way. So now the molecules form this straight line without this kink that allows it to stay solid at room temperature. And this is where we get sort of these, what we think of sort of as unhealthy trans fats that give a lot of processed foods their long shelf life, because they're able to be solid again at room temperature. So while this is certainly a wonderful advancement for the preservation of food, it doesn't work very well in terms of our overall health, because we have this flat structure, these fats are able to be very solid and stack on top of one another, including our arteries. And so this is a big hypothesis as to why trans fats are associated with stroke or those with high-fat diets. So again, this is just another examination of how macromolecules contribute to potentially obesity, and understanding what's happening again at this molecular level that is creating something like a global pandemic of obesity. So in summary for this module, first thing that we want to understand is that our macronutrients in our food, proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, are all sources of dietary energy. And cells carry out chemical reactions that break down our food, that allows us to obtain usable energy in the form of that oh so important molecule, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And we also learned that both cellular respiration and fermentation are two cycles that are used to create ATP. Cellular respiration creates much more ATP than fermentation. However, they both produce these molecules of ATP. And we also observed that photosynthesis and respiration form a cycle. We understand that the products of photosynthesis are required for the reagents of respiration and vice versa. And so that sort of ends what we're going to be talking about in terms of accessing energy. And that's really the overall idea of this entire section, is to understand molecularly how we are able to derive energy and maintain functionality in our cells. So we have an exam this Wednesday, and I will be available for office hours and to answer any questions you might have either during office hours or by email. Good luck. Take some time for yourself. Make sure you check out the online study guide. Okay, bye.